beyond the institutionalized terror and the torture that dehumanized the German population in the entire decade of the 1930s, beyond even that kind of frenetic imperialism that the Third Reich imposed upon Europe and upon the world, and which led that world ultimately to war, behind that terrorism and beyond it, behind that war and beyond it, there is another facet of National Socialism which strikes me as being very much at the heart of the matter, which strikes me as telling a great deal about fascism and why it is that fascism constitutes the kind of menace and threat that it does. Because in the final analysis, it seems to me that what you have with National Socialism, what you have with fascism, is the politics of fraud, the politics of bankruptcy, the politics of the absurd, the politics, if you please, that finally pulverize anything that is rational or normal in the intercourse politically among human beings. Essentially, what I'm saying is that this is National Socialism, a social movement which appealed almost primarily to emotion and which had as its vision a kind of myth, the myth of a racial community that is passed for a socialism, and yet in reality reduced what already were very exploitative class relationships to the most naked kind of power relationship in which the working classes were wholly and completely unprotected. What I'm saying is that the aspirations of human beings, of men and women, that had been macerating for such a long period of time were destroyed in the period of the 1930s behind a camouflage of talk about a revolution that proved to be ultimately a pseudo-revolution. And it is precisely that toying with the aspirations of human beings, precisely that mystification that strikes me as being really beyond the torture and even beyond the war, the very greatest danger that is inscribed in that entire movement of fascism. Which is why it seems to me that the paradigm issue is the issue of what we call the Second Revolution. The issue of the Second Revolution, which was posed in the period of the 1930s, and the manner in which it was resolved tells us a great deal about what Nazism was. When we talk about the issue of the Second Revolution, we're talking about the question of whether or not this Nazism is really going to turn into a revolution, whether it is going to overturn the structure of society and provide another kind of a community, because that really is what the disinherited and the disenchanted in the Weimar Republic, who flocked to the banner of Nazism, thought that it was about to do. And it is precisely that question of the Second Revolution which is decisively resolved in that famous night of the 30th of June of 1934, the so-called Night of the Long Knives, which in effect is the central symbol of what Nazism is as a social movement in the period of the 1930s. And if we talk about a second revolution, we already presuppose a first revolution. And that first revolution was the coming to office of Hitler on the 30th of January of 1933. And it is called the First Revolution because those millions who had voted for the National Socialist Party in July and again in November of 1932, those petty bourgeois, those labels-pay, who filed behind the Nazi banner, didn't realize the kind of deal that had already gone on before Hitler came to power. They did not recognize that there was a very self-conscious kind of liaison between the Nazi leaders and big businessmen. They did not realize that it was in the house of a Cologne banker in January of 1933 that Franz von Papen worked out the arrangement by which Hindenburg would call Hitler to office on the 30th of January. All that was unbeknownst. The people waited, if you please, for a revolution. And there was Hitler in office by the end of January of 1933. And that first revolution had nothing to do with social structure. And it had nothing to do with overturning social structure or making another kind of a society. What that first revolution was about, after all, was an arrogation of political power by the National Socialist Party. A political power that became very quickly almost an absolute political power, although dependent upon the support also of the traditional right. And that first revolution was about the dispossession of certain Jewish businessmen,
or the Aryanization of property, not the redistribution, not the collectivization of property, but the turning over of certain properties into the hands of non-Jews. And that first revolution was about the dismantling of all of those autonomous working class organizations, the political parties and the unions that the working classes had built, the dismantling and the destroying of them. And that first revolution, if you please, is about the sustenance of the elite, is about the buttressing of those traditional capitalist elites that had felt themselves so threatened in the period of the Depression. And you see, it went very swiftly, that first revolution. On the 5th of March of 1933 are the first elections under Hitler's rule. And those elections are carefully prepared, are they not? Because on the 27th of February of 1933 had occurred that Reichstag fire, in which the Parliament building had been burned down. And we know enough about it now to know that it had been the SA, those assault battalions, which were actually responsible for the burning of the Reichstag, but there was ambiguity enough at that time to blame it upon the communists, and consequently to make a public opinion surcharge with the feeling that the communists were going to seize power. And that meant that Hitler could institute and the SA could practice a kind of reign of terror before that election of the 5th of March. Simply move into the streets and try to control the behavior and the voting pattern of those who would go to the polls in March. And even that didn't succeed for the Nazis completely, because on the 5th of March in those elections, if the National Socialists, who had been losing ground, as we know, in those elections of November of 32, if they picked up strength, if they won 288 seats out of 647, even with that reign of terror, they still did not have an absolute majority, and would have to depend upon the support of the traditional right-wing parties that represented monarchism, the great landowners of Prussia, and that certainly represented the big business interests of the ruler. And consequently, there wasn't still that kind of complete control between them. The socialists and the communists won 200 seats in those elections. And so Hitler and his regime moved very swiftly. And what they did was to ban and to drive out of existence the German Communist Party, and to round up its leaders and already to send them off into concentration camps. And it suppressed what was called the Reichsbanner, which was a Republican organization formed by the socialists to defend the Republic. And they dissolved the so-called Iron Front, that Iron Front which had been formed out of socialist clubs in 1931 to try to bring the socialist workers into the streets to combat the Nazis, and that Iron Front likewise dissolved. In other words, there was the use of force in order to buttress the results of elections which were not supreme enough. And under those circumstances, Hitler was able to intimidate this new legislature. And when the Reichstag met on the 21st of March of 1933, there were, believe me, SA people in the streets and in the halls of that Reichstag building, and SS right in the very corridors. And consequently, the intimidation was there when Hitler came to that Reichstag and asked for a law of full powers. And that law of full powers was passed overwhelmingly on the 21st of March, which meant that for a period of 4 years, as the law read, there would be complete power concentrated in the hands of this particular ministry, which effectively was going to be Hitler and his cohort. So that you get that aggregation of political power. On the level of social policy, that social policy has nothing in it that we would define as revolutionary, far from it. Because there was, from the 1st of April of 1933, organized by Joseph Goebbels, who in 1926 had rallied to Hitler very cynically and served him very loyally. Goebbels organized the boycott of Jewish businesses and began that transfer of Jewish businesses into Aryan hands. And along with that came a reorganization of the labor force. The organized trade unions were dissolved, and those free trade unions were now forced to regroup within what was called the labor front. the Labor Front established on the 2nd of May of 1933. And that Labor Front, you see, very much a paradigm of what fascism is at the social plane, a collaboration between employers and workers. That employers and workers in each enterprise would be in the same Labor Front organization. And there was lots of palaver about the honor of workers, and that they would all have a very good life if they fought and worked for the new regime. All of that was there. But when that Labor Front got the enabling law, when a law was passed in January of 1934 that described the organization of capital-labor relations within each enterprise, what it did was to name, if you please, the boss in each enterprise as the Führer. That in each enterprise there would be, as it were, a kind of reflection of the regime total. And consequently, the boss would be considered to be the final arbiter in all relations between capital and labor, the right to strike prohibited, all of the autonomous powers of workers taken out of their hands. All of that, you see, part of the social horizon of National Socialism almost at once. And so far as the traditional elites were concerned, those elites were not only represented in the politics of National Socialism, but represented in the government. Consider, if you please, that first ministry in which Hitler becomes the chancellor is a ministry that has only a minority of Nazis in it. That Hermann Goering, to be sure, who has the greatest and closest ties to the industrialists of Germany, he is the only leading Nazi outside of Hitler who occupies a ministerial position. That the key ministerial position goes to those old elites that have brought Hitler to power precisely at the moment when his influence was waning in Germany, frightened as they were of a potential left-wing government and left-wing threat. And so you get, as the Vice Chancellor, Franz von Papen, and von Papen, with his very close connections with the mining and metallurgical industry, really represents that Ruhr group. And you get, as the Minister of Economics, Alfred Hugenberg. And Hugenberg, after all, who had been formerly a director of the Krupp Steel Works, and who was a great press baron in Germany, represented the most traditional monarchist position politically imaginable. And at the Ministry of Defense was General von Goldberg. And von Goldberg was the close friend of Hindenburg. And he represents the great Prussian landowners and the great Prussian generals. And consequently, that traditional elitist alliance very decidedly inscribed within that first ministry, so that it should not surprise us that a law was passed in July of 1933, which gave almost complete power to the cartels. The cartels, by that law of 1933, were permitted to prevent the appearance of new enterprises in any trade. In other words, there would be no further competition to those who were now cartelized in each industry, and the cartels, by law, were given not only permission but were encouraged to set prices for their products collectively within each industry. All of that is the first revolution. But it really poses the question of the second revolution. Will that be all? All of that went so swiftly that all of those millions who are enrolled in the SA, those who were the petty bourgeois, those who were the disinherited, those who wanted to smash the old regime, still heard ringing in their ears the socialist words of Hitler and the socialist words of Goebbels, and wanted that second revolution. Surely it was going to come. Surely it was not going to be just turning over power to the old elite and assuring that particular power. And by 1934, the issue is at a boil, because there are stimuli for further action and for a further upheaval of German society. One of those stimuli is precisely the fact that the economic crisis is not resolved. And that economic crisis really is central to the whole raison d'etre for Hitler coming to office, presumably. What you have by 1934 is a slight reduction in unemployment, but not very much. It is estimated that the officially unemployed went down from 6 million to 4 million by 1934, largely because of the beginning of the rearmament industry, but certainly not a real resolution of that problem. That industry, industrial capacity, was still working in 1934 at only 80% of its 1928 level. But what is most crucial is that in those 2 years, or year and a half of Hitler's tenure, that the actual real wages or the purchasing power of the working class masses of Germany declined by almost a fourth, declined by 22.5%. The reason being that there was a cutoff, a very severe cutoff of food imports, and that there was, after all, a sacrificing of working class standards in order to import those raw materials which would be necessary for a rearmament program. So that you get really an economic social crisis by 1934. The masses haven't been saved, and as a matter of fact, their very condition is deteriorating. But it is something more than that, because the second of these stimuli is the growing agitation that really comes to center in this very peculiar, almost anarchic organization of the SA, which is almost 2.5 million by 1934, and consequently really corrals a certain mass point of view. Now these, you see, have been people who have gone in with the idea that vaguely there would be some kind of revolution. If you look at the state of mind of the SA as it is described in 1934 by observers, and they find a kind of combination of rancor, of a sense of terror, of these SA going out into the streets and beating up on people and taking out all of those aggressions for some kind of definition or some kind of individuation, but with that, some kind of vague socialism, some kind of vague desire for another kind of a community. And that SA becoming very vested and restless by 1934, posing this question of the Second Revolution. And this becomes all the more pressing because of the leader of the SA at that particular time. Now, the leader of the SA is wrong. And wrong, certainly, from no point of view, a socialist or a revolutionary. An adventurer, yes. Somebody who had been a captain in the German army in the First World War. Somebody who was bohemian. Somebody who flaunted bourgeois standards. But who was not, certainly, in any sense, a revolutionary who had close contact, for example, with the milieu of IG Farben industry, the great chemical trust, but who catalyzed that kind of socializing will in the SA for personal reasons. What Rome wanted, after all, was to make the SA the arbiter of German society. What he wanted was to take this organization and to replace the rest there, to replace the German army, to make of the SA the educator of the nation, the reconstructor of the nation, and to give him, consequently, a very central position, even a position higher, perhaps, than his old comrade Hitler. And consequently, this push of the SA by 1934 began to challenge, at the root, those people who had made that first revolution. Because it challenged, certainly, the army not willing to be replaced by a bunch of half-anarchist amateurs, and consequently fighting hard against the SA. And it threatened the industrialists. Not that the industrialists took very seriously the socialism of the SA, not that they thought it was very coherent, they were much too tough-minded for that, guys like Trump and Sinners and so forth. What they feared, ultimately, was that an SA in power would not be able to carry through the rearmament program for massive rearmament, which that heavy industry needed and wanted in the war. You had to have a professional army, an army that knew how to use this kind of new weaponry, and consequently, the SA stood as a barrier to their very economic profit, to their very economic viability. And in addition to that, the SA and Roth got the enmity of others in the Nazi hierarchy, particularly Goering, who after all was the most conservative of the lot, who had his connections with big industrial circles, and along with Goering, his very faithful friend Hitler, who already is beginning to build a force of his own with the SS, and consequently, who is going to bolt very large in ultimate terms in the Nazi hierarchy. And they go to Hitler, and all of these pressures begin to fall on Hitler, and the question is, will Hitler, after all, reveal himself to be the Nazi of the 25 points, or will he reveal himself to be what he has been all along, a tremendous opportunist, not in the least concerned with any kind of definition of a new society, but rather with that power? How will he reveal himself? And he hesitated, you see, and for good reason. That on the one hand, he didn't like Rome and the SA, that they were rivals, and that they potentially could muck up this Third Reich with their socializing ideas, and getting rid of them was a perfectly sound idea. But to get rid of them is perhaps to fall into the hands of the old elite, to become the prisoner of the big industrialists, of the landowners, and then, after all, must they simply not want to restore the monarchy? Hindenburg was getting old, so old you can't believe it. And consequently, as president, there obviously was not very much more time after the death of Hindenburg. Wouldn't they want, as von Papen was already alluding to, wouldn't they want a monarchy that had nothing to do with Hitler at all? And consequently, he paused and hesitated until a deal was made, a very self-conscious deal, and it germinated among the officers. And it is General Bresenow who makes a kind of plan, and that is that when Hindenburg should die, Hitler should accede to the presidency, or perhaps that office should be abolished and simply merged with the Chancellor's office. In other words, that there will be no threat to Hitler's power, in return for which he will decimate and do it the SA and kill off once and for all this idea of a second revolution. Now that he could accept, because Hitler had already made it clear in 1933 that he thought the revolution was over and that all that counted now was stabilization. Had he not said on the 6th of July of 1933 to the prefect of the Reich, I am opposed to replacing the directors of the economy by National Socialists who understand nothing of economics. Our program doesn't oblige us to be imbeciles and to overturn the structure of society. And consequently, Hitler had no revolutionary intent, and making that deal was perfectly feasible, all the more so since Papen was making noises about a monarchical restoration by the beginning of 1934, and all of that is the cadre for that famous day of the 30th of June of 1934, that so-called night of the long knives, in which the SA and others come to be decimated, and which I consider such a turning point in the evolution of affairs in the 1930s. Now, how that was done was a complicated thing, and it had to do, if you please, with rumor and lie. That from the 25th of June of 1934, the Reichswehr was already in alert. In other words, it had called its troops to attention with the rumor floating around that the SA was going to take to the streets in Berlin and in Munich and in the key cities of Germany, and was going to try to seize power. Rumors that were spread by Goering and by Hitler. Hitler himself had gone on the 29th of June to Essen in the Ruhr. He had gone there for the wedding of a Gauleiter to see also Krupp and Thyssen, and it was there in Essen that he was joined by Goebbels, who said, back in Berlin, the SA is about to rise in the streets and to take power, which was a thoroughgoing myth. Hitler flipped out, and consequently rushed immediately to Munich. And when he got to Munich, the Reichswehr told him, yes, the SA was planning to seize power, and what he demanded at once was Count Rome and the top leadership of that SA, and they were all having a holiday, an orgy, if you please, as is the case with the SA, and they were having this at Badisa, and he fled to Badisa, Hitler did, with a motorized column, arriving there at 5 in the morning. And they were all besotten by that time. Visconti captures it very well in the Dam, and when Hitler got there, they were all sprawled out and asleep. He finally discovered where Rome was staying, in which room. Rome staying there with his chauffeur. Hitler bangs on the door. Rome says, "Who is there?" And the answer is, "Hitler." Opens the door. Well, that's very mind-blowing. Opens the door at that point, and Hitler is there. And of course, his court, with one of his unbelievable and magnificent perorations, denounces and curses and orders the arrest of this leadership and their execution in the night of the 29th to the 30th of June, and through the day of the 30th of June. Ultimately, in Berlin, in Munich, in Bad Wiesen, there were 1,076 people executed. And those were not only the top leadership of the SA, because Hitler was more encompassing than that, but they were a whole cluster of rivals. They were, for example, certain monarchists who supported Papen's plan for a restoration of the monarchy. They were certain generals, like Streicher, for example, who had opposed Hitler, and in the final analysis, his inter-party rivals. It was then that Gregor Strasser was executed, and consequently, those rivalries were snuffed out. And you see what that night means, and you see what the importance of it is. That it is, in the first place, the escalation of the SS and Himmler, because they were the ones who very efficiently carried out this action. It was, in the second place, and quite crucially, it was the end of any semblance of legalism. Because not only were these executions simply ordered without any due process at all, but that Hitler's key jurist, a man named Carl Schmitt, then justified it on a ground that would be the legal basis for the regime from then on, that the law in Germany emanates from the will of the Führer, and consequently that what he orders then is legal. But what is most important is that it is the end of the petty bourgeois revolution, that it is the end of any such aspiration, of any such design, really to reconstruct and to redesign German society. All of which means that you have a society in which power, ultimately, social and economic power, rests with the great industrialists. That the great industrialists are the beneficiaries of the night of the 30th of June, and ultimately the beneficiaries of the regime. And I say that at this particular point without any qualification, that all of those historical interpretations, that ultimately big capitalism was disciplined by the Nazis, that ultimately the Nazi regime itself dominated over big business and subordinated it to its will, that all of that misses the point. That big business did not need to control the political levers so long as those levers were being pulled in their direction and for their benefit, which happened in the course of this regime. In the most naked way, I tell you, it is a regime that supported that sector of German society against the pretensions of the working class, against the pretensions of the lower middle class. And yet, it is a bit more sophisticated than that. Because when we talk about German big business, or we talk about German industrialists, they are not to be treated in blocks. They are themselves divided. And the division, likewise, tells us something about the primary profiteers of the regime. That there were essentially two major groups in German enterprise or German industry. There was an old ruling group, and that is the Ruhr group. In other words, the heavy industry, the iron, the steel, the coal, the mining metallurgical industry of the Ruhr, and they have as their allies the great landowners of East Prussia. And consequently, you have the traditional ruling strata. In other words, the group that had profiteered and benefited in Hohenzollern in Germany and even through much of the Weimar period. But there was a rival group that emerged in the course of the First World War, and that became more important in the period of the 20s. And this is the most modern sector of industry. We're talking about the chemical and electrical industry. We're talking about IG farming, especially. We're talking about that enterprise that really rationalized its procedures and processes in the 20s, that was the most modernized, the most efficient sector of German industry, and that also had a certain, if you can call it that, a certain progressive slant about society. These were the industrialists who supported some of the very mild reforms of Germany, or supported some of the very minor reforms right before Hitler came to power, and even tried to bar his route. In other words, sophisticated enough to try to co-opt the working class rather than simply to crush it. Now, this sector was ousted from effective political influence with the rise of Hitler. Hitler's first ministry, after all, was a ministry that represented the Ruhr industrialists. It represented them with Papen, with Goldberg, and it certainly represented the old Prussian landowners and the military caste with General von Blomberg. And consequently, for a period of time, this electrical chemical group seems to be ousted. Then comes a shift. And the shift comes at the beginning of 1934. And Goldberg is forced out of office as Minister of Economics, and he is replaced by a representative of the Chemical Trust, a man named Kurt Schmidt. And Schmidt, you see, has a different design for economic development than the big, heavy industry capitalists want. What his design is to stress consumer industry. In other words, to encourage the inflow into Germany of food from the outside, to keep wages reasonably low, but to expand consumer industry, which means, in terms of the allocation of resources, a very slow, a very gradual rearmament. Now you can understand why the chemical and electrical trade, which deals so much with consumer goods, would want this. But you can also understand the kind of very powerful dinosaur-like struggle that went on around Hitler between these particular groups. Because the right there, the army, obviously opposed Schmidt and that particular design because they wanted very rapid rearmament. And the heavy industry people certainly opposed it because they likewise wanted those particular markets. And consequently, they found favor in the ministry from Goering, and particularly, they found a key man who will be a key man in the whole social and economic direction of National Socialism, and that's Hjalmar Schacht. Now, Schacht had been the president of the Reichsbank. In other words, the president of the semi-state bank of Germany, and a very powerful financier. And Schacht had resigned as president of the Reichsbank in 1930 because he had opposed the Young Plan. He had opposed accepting this reparations plan. And Schacht was connected not only with the big bank, but with Ruhr industry. And what he wanted was to get back his position in the Reichsbank, but also to design the economic development of Germany. And so he played his game with Hitler, and he supported Hitler early, about 1930. And even when Hitler's fortune seemed to wane in November of 1932, he stuck by Hitler and encouraged him, and became a liaison between Hitler and the industrialists, and consequently was rewarded. In March of 1934, he was restored as president of the Reichsbank, and now he became the man of heavy industry. And what they wanted was that Kurt Schmidt should be replaced as the Minister of Economics by Schacht. Because Schacht's idea was to start rearmament and to make the recovery of Germany upon that particular principle. And they got to Hitler, and after the night of the 30th of June of 1934, Schmidt resigned, thinking that if, after all, heavy industry and the rest there would assassinate SA people, they might do it to him. He confessed that at Nuremberg in 1946, that he was very frightened, and he resigned, and Schacht becomes the Minister of Economics, and essentially it means the dominion within the ministry of the heavy industry group, that old kind of ruling structure that you have had in the Ruhr, that will be serviced, that will very much be catered to in the development of National Socialist economics. All of which means that you have certain victors after June of 1934. You have those victors out of that Ruhr group, but let me say something to you parenthetically. It doesn't mean that I.G. Farthing and the electrical and chemical trade then went hand in hand to bed. That ultimately they came out very well likewise, even though never in the inner circle, their profits grew. And their profits grew, as all industrial profits did under National Socialism, astronomically. The figures are extraordinary. That what you have, you see, and what this is all about, is the culmination of cartelization. That between 1933 and 1938, there is a 10% decline in the number of enterprises in Germany. And that during that period of time, the capital in the possession of corporations increases immensely. The average capital in 1933 within a corporation had been about 2 million marks. The capital rose to 6 million by 1939. It meant that profits were considered to have tripled in the period between 1933 and 39. But what is crucial is that tendency, which culminates in a law of 1939, that if a business does not do a certain level of sales, that it is to perform and by obligation to sell out to one of the larger enterprises. It is, in other words, state encouragement and it is state compulsion really to cartelize. All of this is very central. So that if you draw a diagram of how power looks in the Third Reich, it is a kind of a design in which you have Hitler and Himmler with the SS at the political level. And you have the great industrialists, especially the Ruhr industrialists, with their landed allies in East Prussia at the social and economic level. And you have finally the Reichswehr, or the army, which not only comes out victorious in 1934, but likewise is assured of rearmament. Now that changes in one very important respect. By the end of the Nazi period, that diagram, I think, shifts to a two-part rather than a three-part diagram. That it is not a question of the Nazi political group and big business and the army, but it is really the Hitler group and the SS plus big business. That becomes the alliance. That ultimately the army is squeezed out really of effective power or effective control. That Hitler, in February of 1938, assumed direct command of the armed forces, makes a coup in an army that really hated him and that really resented that, but made that particular concession to him, or was unable to fight back, because by that time there is yet another power force, and that is the SS. And the SS, you see, likewise tells you something about this regime, because it is to be contrasted with the SA. The SA was destroyed in 1934, and it was destroyed because it was a mass organization, and a mass organization that was anarchic, that really had a kind of socializing or anarchic spirit in it that you couldn't trust. And the SA is a Praetorian guard that is really very different. It is disciplined, it is orderly, and it never challenges the elite. And that becomes the immense contrast. The SS, you see, is never a mass organization. If it has 50,000 in that police force in 1933, It has 250,000 by the outbreak of the war, not a mass force. And by social origin, a bit different than the SA, really much more out of the prosperous stratum of the middle bourgeoisie, much more out of the prosperous stratum of the peasantry. But what is the primary difference is that it never thought of itself as an alternate society. It never thought of itself really as the root of another kind of a society. And you get it, if I can make this analogy, in the uses of terror or the uses of torture by SA and SS. The SA were god-awful, and they went to the streets and they really did the most depraved things, but you get that tremendous sense of psychic disorder. You get people really that simply want to manifest themselves, and that do it with that kind of immense frustration, with that dementia that comes out of dislocated people. They are really anarchisants. They are almost anarchists in the way in which they commit their violence. SS violence is different. It's systematic. It's dehydrated of emotion. It's the kind of thing in which you have people doing their job, and doing their jobs as the Praetorian Guard for a certain kind of system, for a certain kind of regime. It's only these SS types, if you please, that really could install a totalitarian regime, for whom there was absolutely no human content in the kind of terror that they imposed, who could shuffle off the 12 million people into gas chambers without really any kind of reflection as to the human implications of it. And terribly, terribly important, that contrast. If you ever saw a movie called The Wild Bunch, it had a most interesting contrast in forms of violence, because there was freebooting violence, which comes out of the frustration of a lost status, which comes out of the frustration of having no place in a society, and against, you see, very orderly violence, in that instance, the violence of the railroad company that simply will not permit freebooters to move around. And you get the same kind of contrast here, it seems to me, between SA and SS. And something immensely important for us to know. And that is that it installing itself as really the armed power of the Nazi regime. What the SS discovered was a principle that I presume we have all discovered by now. And that is that the way in which you install yourself as a kind of inviolable force is to penetrate the police. That the police really are at the very heart of power in organized mass society. And the SS, after all, found its foothold first in those police forces of Germany. It is Hitler, after all, who is named the director of all the police forces of Germany in 1936, which gives him his leverage. And from that point, you see, you can move. And the SS then begins to incubate or to infiltrate other organizations and to purify them, to keep them sound within the structure. Agricultural, professional organizations, even the Foreign Service, Ribbentrop is their man, carries on almost his own separate diplomacy over and above the Minister of Foreign Affairs and so forth. And so, by the time you come to the war, what you have in this revolution is really a combination of that big business with a Hitler group that has now arrogated complete and total political power through the uses and abuses of the SS. And it really raises that question that historians keep raising. And that is that if the Hitler regime subordinated capital, if in the course of preparing for the war and during the war, it allocated resources, it told capitalists after all what they must produce, isn't it really the ruling structure, and isn't capitalism simply its particular client? And I think that's a totally nonsensical proposition. In the final analysis, what German big business did in the 1930s is exactly what it did in the period of the Hohenzollern Empire. It gave over to another political group in the Hohenzollern Empire, the Prussian Junkers, the army, Bismarck, the power to do the things that it wanted done in order to survive and to expand. And that's precisely what the Hitler group did. because the paradigm issue is the issue of imperialism. And when the Third Reich commits itself to imperialism, then it serves its particular client. And there's a book called Talks with Hitler, innocent title. And it's a book written by Herman Rauschning, and Rauschning was the president of the Danzig Senate. And he talked to Hitler, and he recorded what Hitler said his designs were in foreign policy. This in 1934 and 1935. And Hitler's designs in foreign policy, I suppose one could have gleaned from Mein Kampf, but you could have said, oh well, Mein Kampf was written after all in prison, and he was not to be taken seriously. And here is Hitler as head of state saying what it is that he desires, what the goal of the Third Reich is, what the goal of German society is. It is to make, of course, for a greater Germany. It is to encompass 100 million Germans in Central Europe, which means the conquest of Austria, the conquest of Czechoslovakia, and which means the conquest of part of Poland. Beyond that, says Hitler, the Slavs are inferior people, and they must be subdued, they must be colonized, they must be reduced to agricultural work, and beyond that, there must be a dominion of Germany, as he called it, by which, after all, we must translate and mean a dominion of the German market all over Europe. It is really to create a greater German market, the exploitation of the raw materials and the uses of German industry to fill the markets of Europe. All of that was Hitler's design, and there was no barrier internationally against it. The League of Nations, which presumably had been established in order to make a barrier against aggression, the League of Nations, a perfectly helpless organization. When Mussolini advanced into Ethiopia in 1935, there were sanctions imposed that were never really carried through, and consequently the conquest was simple and easy for Mussolini. And so the real question before Europe, before human beings, before men and women who had built organizations and seen their brethren destroyed in Central Europe, the issue was, how were people to cope with that threat? And therein lies the story of the 1930s. Because in the final analysis, you see, the Russians had come down to 1934 perfectly convinced that they could build socialism in that country. Stalin, by 1934, had gone through collectivization and industrialization, and the problem was, would the Third Reich destroy the balance? Would there be an attack upon Russia? And so it became the Russian position, or Stalin's position, that what there had to be in order to protect this enterprise in Russia was collective security. That all powers threatened by the expansionism of Germany had to make collective pacts in order to prevent that aggression. But then there were those fifth columns. There were all of those fascist movements, sympathetic fascist movements growing in size, country after country, the so-called democratic countries, how to cope with fascism at home, which might add friends to Nazi Germany, and the answer there, just as the answer internationally was collective security, the answer there was, populaire, the popular front, that socialists and communists ought to join with bourgeois parties to protect and preserve republics, democracies, all of those things that had been destroyed in Germany, collective security and popular front, that became the theme of the 1930s, and maybe it begs the question, because the question we really want to ask, in the face of this bogus revolution in Central Europe, in the face of all of the kind of regimes that Nazi Germany established, the question we ask is whether all of that tremendous effort for collective security and for popular front which failed, all of that effort to stop fascism, to contain it, to defeat it, whether that was the answer, or whether the answer to a bogus revolution, whether the answer to that fascism was not a real revolution. And that is the question for the 30s. And therein lies the tragedy, because it is the question rarely posed, but posed really
in the villages of Spain.